Welcome to Big Business This Week. I'm JD Durkin here on the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. No shortage of news to dig into this week, but the big story, of course, everyone's talking about the federal government shutdown in Washington, which officially went into effect at midnight Wednesday, October 1st. How will it affect you, your family, business in America, as well as the broader financial markets? Matt Peterson joins us now. He is Barron's Ideas editor to help me, at least, better understand what's at stake here. Matt, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so once again, and I say once again because it's not that we've had one of these recently, but we have had them in the not too distant past, a lapse in federal government spending. Matt, how did we get to this particular one?
Well, we got there the same way we've gotten to all the other ones, which is that you have a big partisan conflict in Congress where the two parties just refuse to work together on extending a budget. In this case, it is Democrats who put their foot down and declined to vote in favor of a Republican funding bill that would keep the government open for a little bit. They don't need a whole lot of Democrats to pass this thing, but they need a couple. And so far, Democrats are by and large refusing to help them.
What do we know about the Republicans' proposal? Was it a stopgap that they were putting up, which sometimes we have around this time of year where they basically try and punt the spending responsibilities a few more months, and then we kind of have this messy, like, didn't we just do this style fight right around the holidays? What was the hopeful timeline if you're in the GOP?
Yeah, that's right. So the end of the federal fiscal year is September 30th. And so every year they need to renew government funding for all the basic programs that the government does. And if not, they shut down. That's what's happened. The funding has generally not been renewed. And so programs are shut down. The fight at the moment is over whether or not there should be one of these temporary stopgap bills to just keep things open while the two sides keep talking. But, it's one little part of a bigger ongoing fight between Republicans and Democrats about how the Trump administration gets to manage the government and the wider economy. And the way to think about this shutdown is just, Democrats have seen this as the most effective leverage that they have to actually, really object in some sort of consequential way to what the president is doing. So, the nuts and the bolts of the shutdown do matter, but they're really fighting over bigger stuff, and it's not really so much about whether or not anybody wants the government to be open today, tomorrow, the next day.
Matt, please correct me if I'm wrong. In the Schoolhouse Rock days of things, when you learn about the ways things should work on Capitol Hill, there are 12 separate appropriations bills that members of Congress are supposed to pass, and the idea being these 12 tranches cover every dollar in one of the 12 buckets that Congress spends money on, and they almost never, and I do mean almost never, pass the 12 separate bills. And so now they're left with this kind of like last ditch 11th hour effort of like, oh yeah, that's right, we forgot we were supposed to fund the government. Had they passed the 12 bills the way some Republicans like Thomas Massey have called for many times, could that in theory have avoided this particular shutdown?
I don't think this was in Schoolhouse Rock, but I'll have to go back and re-listen to that. No, they have not passed these individual appropriations bills. And right, that was supposed to be one of the big things that this Congress was going to do. So a lot of Republicans, Massey and many others, have been really frustrated with the way that Republican leadership has managed budget processes, which is basically, the top leadership in Congress sort of gets together behind closed doors and decides like this is what we're going to move ahead and what we're not. And so all these guys who are on individual committees get frustrated because they don't really get a say in how things are supposed to work. And so supposedly one of the things that the Mike Johnson House in particular was going to do was bring us back to these days where you have sort of robust debate on policy. The problem is that sounds great, when you're in Schoolhouse Rock land, but in practice, it's super hard. And Republicans did not get together to finish all of these bills before that October 1st deadline when they need to. And so, part of this is happening because Republicans have just not been able to find the time to get together to do this process that they thought they would do. And by the way, they spent a lot of time on this other big thing, the reconciliation bill, big tax and policy bill that passed earlier in the year, which does a lot of things, but it does not keep the government open.
Yeah, and the reconciliation bill in the Senate, you only need 50 plus one. You don't need that typical 60 vote threshold. So where does that leave us in terms of if and you might be like I used to be when I covered the Hill. You love the whip count numbers, and you're sitting there and you're watching the votes on C-SPAN. You're talking with sources. You're trying to see who falls into what camp. What's kind of the math to get there with regards to those handful, I should say, of maybe kind of standout Senate Democrats that Republican leadership really need in order to keep the lights or turn the lights back on?
Right. The magic number is 7. So Republicans have 53 votes in the Senate. They have 53 seats. They need 60 to pass a government funding bill. They don't get to use the special procedures that they used for reconciliation and that they can use to approve judges, for instance. This is where the filibuster still lives on a little bit, is in these kind of day-to-day government votes. So Republicans have been, their shutdown strategy is to put pressure on enough of the kind of moderate Democrats to get them to flip. The initial vote attracted three Democratic senators who were, wavering enough to support the Republican bill. They didn't want to keep, or they didn't want to be on record keeping the government shut down. And so the Republican strategy from here on out is to get the rest of them to put enough pressure on Senate leadership, on Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries in the House, but especially Schumer, to allow them to go forward and flip. And so that's basically the most likely way that this ends, is that over time Republicans pick up enough Senate Democrats that they can move ahead, even though the bulk of Democrats still oppose the plan.
Matt, try and help me better understand what Democrats are actively lobbying for as the negotiations continue, given so many of them, leaders Jeffrey, Schumer, many others, they continue to dig in their heels despite pressure from the White House.
Democrats, the big thing that Democrats want is a commitment from the Republicans to make sure that extensions to Obamacare funding go through. So basically, during COVID, the government added a bunch of additional subsidies to make it easier for lots of people to buy subsidized government healthcare, government subsidized private healthcare. And those things expire later this year. They don't expire yet. They don't expire with this shutdown, so they're still going on right now, but they're going to expire soon. And the arguments that Democrats have been making is that, if we do not act, sort of, I think it's 15 million people get kicked off of insurance, essentially. And they're worried about that. And they want some assurances from Republicans that they're going to do a deal. A lot of Republicans just don't want to do this. It's the kind of thing where, keeping government subsidies for healthcare is probably popular enough in Congress that if you had an open vote, it would pass. More Democrats would support it than Republicans, but enough to allow it to pass. But so far, the Republicans are resisting giving in to Democrats' demands on this. They're saying, we'll talk about this once you guys reopen the government. Democrats are saying, well, you haven't listened to us about anything else. So, why would we trust you on that? This is our one moment of leverage. There are some other sort of secondary issues, but that's the big one. And then I think, again, part of the context here is just frustration and the way that Trump does business. You can't take that out of this equation. You might have had a negotiation with a different president if there were more trust between Congress, between Democrats in Congress in particular, and the administration. But you may remember, for instance, that Trump refused to sit down with congressional Democrats right before the vote until the very, very last second. And that's just indicative of this kind of bigger breakdown that's driving Democrats to just say, no way, we've had enough here.
I know it's impossible to predict how long this may go on for. Previous lapses in federal government spending, they can range from a few hours. I've had those shutdowns where by the time you wake up the next morning, it's like, oh, actually, they came to a 3 a.m. deal. And then we've had some that have stretched on for more than 30 days. And I remember, and sometimes they run around this time of year. Sometimes they're closer right around to the holiday season. Um, any sense on how long this could go for based on just early rhetoric from leaders on both sides?
It is Pretty hard to say how long this one will go. The last one went 35 days under the first Trump administration. And as you were saying, that happened over Christmas because they had a little bit of negotiating in the run up to that moment, right? So they were able to agree to these kind of stopgap measures, and then those talks fell apart. But right now, we haven't even got to that point where you have sort of temporary agreement that sort of breaks down. You couldn't get any agreement here. So that suggests that, maybe this will go on for a while. The case for a shorter shutdown, and probably the earliest it might end, would be when the House comes into session on Tuesday of next week. Uh, so the case for that is that there are already some Democratic senators who are leaning, these three folks who had, initially voted to support the Republican plan. The fact that there are people who are already kind of anxious about this suggests that maybe there will be more defections here sooner rather than later. But I think, like, and for sort of a business audience, the important thing to understand is that, like, this is coming in this really frustrated political context where nobody sort of trusts the rules anymore. And so it is entirely possible that this thing could just kind of keep dragging on because everybody feels so entrenched on their own sides and so committed to their bases, their respective bases, that they just don't see any value in compromising. That's the thing I worry about.
I'll ask you a bit more about the broader financial market reaction in a second, but first, just for the average day-to-day American, whether or not that person is even a casual consumer of news or not, help remind me the sorts of, how do we separate between essential versus non-essential services? Talk of furloughs. Some people will remember previously you've had things like national monuments may stay closed. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. What are we looking at this time around?
So every time we go through this, each agency of government goes through and makes a list of all the people who are essential or not essential. The essential people tend to be those who are in, positions that matter to sort of like life and safety and like the basic financial functionings of government. So there are about 750,000 people who are on furlough right now across the federal government. Not on furlough includes, basically the entire military, although they may not get paid. Everybody has to show up for work if they're essential workers, but they don't get paychecks, unfortunately. Um, but so, in past shutdowns, exactly like we've had national parks close. In this case, national parks are open temporarily, but will close if the shutdown lingers on. The TSA is still working, so you can keep flying as you expect. FAA folks are in the towers watching planes, come in and out. New FAA folks are not getting trained though, right? So it's sort of one of these short-term, long-term things where if you're worried about, the sort of safety of air travel, it's not going to hit today, but this is like a long-term issue that's going to come back to haunt us. The Fed is open. Most parts of the Treasury are open. So, there's a lot of government business that actually continues. I think it's about 60% of the government that still remains open. Sometimes we call these a partial government shutdown because like actually a lot of it is still open. Social security checks still go out. That's really important. That worries a lot of people, but it's pretty hard to sign up as a new member of Social Security.
And you mentioned the Fed. Lisa Cook still has her job. It's a different story, but for whatever it's worth, she is still there. For federal government employees on furlough or people who are forced to work and don't get back pay, when we
They will get
expect
back pay.
the lights to get turned back on, right?
They're required to get back pay under some legislation that passed after the last time we did this. So yeah, the money all comes back, and that's it's really tough for people who don't get paychecks. Don't want to minimize that at all. From a kind of big economic picture, that's one of the reasons why shutdowns don't matter that much. Is that everybody gets paid back eventually. They just get people have to kind of find a way to muddle through if they're not getting those paychecks for now.
Matt, you and I are doing this conversation not just on the first day of October, but the first day of Q4 and the first day, technically, without the lights of the government on. Somewhat of a muted or mixed reaction, at least on the equity side. Looks like we've got yields slightly in retreat on the day. We've had a broader energy sell-off so far week to date, which is maybe not directly tied to what's going on here the last 14 hours or so. What will you be looking for to give you some sense about Wall Street's reaction, given on the one hand, there's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of talk about inflated valuations on the market. Just got through earnings season. We're in another interest rate cutting cycle, and that's all good news. But markets are going to look for data and look for stability at some point.
Yeah. Specifically, the thing that I'm going to be watching for is the dollar, and I'll come back and explain why that matters. But you're absolutely right. So, I think in the last 6 shutdowns, under 5 of them, the stock market has gone up. So the stock market has a history of just basically ignoring this, and that makes a lot of sense because big companies, are still doing business. This is a government shutdown. It's not a private sector shutdown. So, maybe if you're a defense contractor, maybe your funding gets delayed or something like that, but that's not most companies. So for the most part, the economy just keeps rolling on here. And so you won't see an obvious reaction in the stock market. And similarly, the bond market, you may see a little bit of reaction in treasuries because people worry that this means that we will never fix the budget problems. But that's was true yesterday. It will be true tomorrow. Whatever happens to the shutdown, that we'll have these debt problems that we always worry about. But where we do see some effect in the financial markets is in sort of global investors' reaction to the kind of big political changes in the country. And we've seen, the dollar sell off by about 10% over the course of the year as global investors have said, I don't want to be fully exposed to, the U.S. stock market in the way that I always was. I want to hedge those bets a little bit, and so this has become the kind of channel through which global investors, express anxiety about political fights in the U.S. And that does seem to be holding true. Or in the early days of the shutdown, that we're seeing the dollar continue to be weak. It doesn't matter a huge amount for sort of day-to-day people in the market. If you're an investor in U.S. stocks, then you can more or less ignore this. And the swings are not so rapid that it makes stuff really expensive to buy, which is the case that it would be if you saw a really fast shift in the dollar. But it does add up over time. And it's one of the things that people worry about on the inflation side is a weaker dollar makes it more expensive to buy stuff from overseas. So, this could have some long-term economic consequences. And so far it's limited to that.
And that weakened dollar, I mean, I feel like people may really see it if they have been travelers the last 5 years. I just got back from Europe not long ago and said, wait, that's as far as my dollar gets me now in a place like Scotland or a place like England. That dollar index we follow very trackly, to your point, down 9.9% or so year to date. And you mentioned a few of the big defense contractors. We are seeing slight downward pressure on the day for names like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and others. Okay, before we wrap up, give me a sense on what you'll be watching for here. This is the time of year. I know you've lived through this many times. There's no shortage of political theatrics. How do we separate signal from noise?
There are. You want to watch the votes. So one of the helpful things that the Senate is doing is that it's showing up every day, even on holidays, and voting on this measure, partially because folks want to put pressure on everybody for failing to keep the government open. But that does give us this kind of live sense of if there's anybody in Congress seriously wavering. Similarly, you want to watch whether there are meetings between the president and senior Democrats, because that's where a compromise would be worked out. And, basically Trump will have to sign off on whatever final agreement is made to end this shutdown. So his involvement in any kind of negotiations will be really crucial. And then, finally, I would just sort of watch the pain level. One of the differences about the way this is going on now is that folks remember Doge, big round of government cuts at the beginning of the Trump administration. The Trump administration has said they're going to do another round of those. And if those go really deep, that could start to worry, constituents who will call their offices and say, hey, I'm worried about what's happening to the federal government, and that'll sort of feed back up. And so if you see big layoffs, not just the furloughs, people who can't show up but will get paid later, but people actually getting fired, that will be a sign of the kind of dynamic changing here.
Matt, I can't imagine President Donald Trump tweeting out those AI videos about Jeffries and Schumer, about Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer. That's not going to help negotiations very much. That I would argue is different, right? We did not see that with the Obamacare related shutdown in 2013. The use of social media to needle your political opponents. I got to imagine that makes things at least a little bit more difficult.
Look, the Republicans have an incredible messaging tool here in the president who is willing to throw absolutely anything at his political opponents. And yeah, I mean, putting a sombrero on Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader, is like a great way to show how little he cares about the minority's opinion here, Democrats' opinion. And I expect we will see a lot more of that before this is out.
Buckle up. I have a sneaking suspicion we're not going to get a solution this afternoon. We may be in this for a while. So I hope you'll come back and revisit us and keep us updated because you're the perfect guest to talk to about what's at stake here. Matt Peterson, Barron's Ideas Editor. Thank you as always, Matt. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.